Government and the media are no longer trusted by South Africans. That's according to the 2021 Edelman Trust Barometer. South African society is in a quest to manage the COVID-19 pandemic that has seen various political formations, civil society and business throwing their weight behind fighting the pandemic. The latest survey gauges just some of the sentiment in the country. Well, to unpack this further for us tonight is the Managing Director of Edelman South Afrika, Karina Creera. Karina, good evening and thank you so much for your time tonight. Firstly, let's just talk about who you were surveying in this work and, just what some of the limitations of the study are before we get into your findings.
Sure. Good evening, Kathy, and good evening to your viewers as well. Thanks for having me. Well, Edelman has been studying trust for over 20 years now. We really do believe that trust is the ultimate currency in the relationship between four main institutions and their stakeholder groups, that being business, the private sector, organizations and brands, governments, NGOs, and the media. We really believe that trust defines an organization's license to operate, and that it can have a major effect on how consumers and customers feel about a company's products, how they're able to manage crisis and risk, and whether they be able to better engage with their employees. Our study every year really looks at an online survey in 28 countries, usually around just over 1,000 people surveyed, that are broken into two segments of what we call the informed public and then the mass population outside of that. So it really is it's a representative sample of how people are feeling against those levels of trust within the four main institutions. And thereafter, we break that down to see what some of those complexities are around the results.
Trust is a difficult thing to measure because you're almost trying to get a sense of something that's not quite tangible. So, what are some of the markers that you look at to show you exactly whether people are being more or less trusting?
So our questions are very much geared around whether people believe that institutions broadly are able to and are willing to do the right thing, if we had to really put it at simplest level. But trust in the model wherein we survey it is really looking at four dimensions. And those are ability, so an organization or an institution's ability to just do its job and do it effectively. Integrity, so does it keep its promises? Its dependability, does it do what it say it's going to do? And finally, purpose. So what sort of contribution does that institution make towards society? And that is a traditional model of trust that we've studied for over these 20 years. And in last year's study, what we actually found was we could probably simplify those further into two segments, that being this idea of competence, so the ability, and ethics. And ethics is really where we feel that most of the pressure comes from in those results. It's really about saying, does this institution do the right thing? Do we feel like they're making the right decisions for us? What is the impact for us as consumers, as society, based on those decisions that our societal leaders from those institutions take?
Karina, on that score, then it becomes absolutely devastating to have not just government, but the media and NGOs scoring so lowly. Tell us about the results.
Well, typically NGOs have scored really high on our Trust Barometer scoring over the years. We've been doing this for about 7 years in South Africa. And obviously more than 20 years around the world. So NGOs haven't fared too badly, but this was the first year that we saw business surpass NGOs as the most trusted institution in South Africa. Unfortunately, government and media have fared fairly poorly in terms of year-on-year trust results. But that being said, from last year to this year, we did see an uptick. So we actually saw an uptick of 7 points in levels of trust for government this year, which was very, very encouraging. It sounds like a small amount, but it actually makes quite a big difference. But unfortunately, they remain still in a distrusted category, according to how we score those indices. And media as well, unfortunately, they also made marginal gains, but they also remain in that distrusted category.
Are you able to break down in which of the categories or the subcategories that you've identified where you find that your respondents in the survey are actually rating then whether it's government or the media or even NGOs lower?
So when we look at a broad ranking of trust and an index around the institutions, we ask a very broad question as part of our research to say, do you trust this institution to do the right thing? And then that gives us a general scoring of both of all the institutions. Thereafter, we have specific questions around what's happening perhaps in those areas that perhaps guide us and give us a bit of a better story around what's happening. So, for example, in the government and the media space, what we've seen is that people just feel like societal leaders are not telling them the truth. Mm-hmm. And I think in a year, and if we think about the backdrop against when this research was conducted, which was actually October, November of last year. So you can imagine what was happening in our worlds at that point in time. What people were really fearing, obviously, was primarily the COVID pandemic over and above some of the other challenges that we have in this country. And if you can imagine this backdrop of fear and the sense of society feeling really worried for themselves, they're worried for their health, they're worried for their livelihoods, they're worried for their jobs. And against that backdrop, you can imagine how levels of trust get very tested, because when people feel fearful, they turn to leaders, they turn to leadership to help guide them out of this crisis. And that's why I think the scores that we saw that were improving, which were government and media, were actually a good sign that people felt that perhaps they were trying to do a good job during the COVID pandemic. But potentially this could be a trust bubble, because as I say, prior to that, year on year, we have seen this downturn in both of those institutions. And unfortunately, if we look on a global level, South Africa has the lowest levels of trust in government. Aside from Nigeria, was the first time we've surveyed in that country this year, aside only to Nigeria, the lowest levels of trust globally.
Let's talk then about business and what it is that business is doing to get it right.
Well, I think business has done a lot right. I think people acknowledge from last year business's response to the pandemic. And I think there were many efforts to partner with government in solving some of our societal challenges that we had at the time. And I think the sense was really from people that business stepped up. They really paid attention to what was happening with their employees, with the communities. There was a sense that they were really looking at finding ways to really prioritize helping people over sort of this idea of short-term profits. And really, if we think about some of the relief efforts, if we think about the donations, if we think about the manufacturing efforts behind the vaccine, I think the private sector had a real opportunity to step up to the plate and really build some trust back last year.
All right. And I suppose at this point, you're going to be doing work for your 2021 survey. Are you expecting that these results might change because people's circumstances could well change? So the context that the country is in, whether or not people have been able to receive COVID-19 vaccines, whether or not we've been able to get out of this crisis, all of that, I imagine, all of those things are mitigating factors.
Absolutely. I think people have also acknowledged that outside of the COVID-19 pandemic, and we have yet to see how that plays out here, whether we're going to see another wave of that. But I think on top of that, people are feeling like there are foundational problems that need to be addressed in our society. And they've cited those as obviously healthcare challenges, education challenges that we've seen, and the pressure that's put in terms of the online schooling. And I think this idea of a 49% level of a hesitancy around vaccination is going to play into the narrative throughout this year. And I think that's going to be very telling about how the rest of this year plays out for us. We hope, looking at the State of the Nation address, that there are definitely some moves towards finding ways to really realize an idea of economic prosperity. And there's efforts from government to really put us on the right course for that. If we do start to see some moves in that direction this year, then I think this idea of people really fearing for their lives are poor, and their jobs are poor unemployment figures at the moment. If that manages to start righting itself a little bit, if we're able to achieve herd immunity around vaccinations and we get that right, potentially we may see a slightly more positive picture next year, and we're hopeful for that.
Managing Director of Edelman South Africa, Karina Crera, thank you so much for your time tonight.